Well, we are in the second week of our sermon series on the book of Job. Last week, we talked about how God allowed Satan to take everything from Job. His wealth, his servants, even his children. We talked about how you and I react when things suddenly go wrong, especially when, as it was with Job, it was through no fault of his own. He had not done anything wrong. And today, we're going to talk about how Job reacted. More importantly, we're going to talk about why Job reacted that way, how Job's attitude can help us handle it when things start to suddenly go wrong. And again, just to remind you where we left off last week, Job has had a series of messengers come up to him, one after another after another. He finds out that all his donkeys have been stolen, his sheep have been killed, his camels have been stolen, his servants have been killed, and all of his children have died in a terrible accident. And what did Job do? Job worshipped God. Think about that. Job had just lost everything. A large herd of animals was how people measured wealth in those days. And the number of servants he had were a measure of it too. And not only did Job lose every bit of wealth he had, all of his children were killed. I know some of you know how painful, how devastating that can be. And yet, Job's response was to worship God. And listen to what Job says. Naked I came from my mother's womb, and naked I will depart. The Lord gave, the Lord has taken away. May the name of the Lord be praised. We'll come back to that, because as bad as things were for Job at this point, they're about to get worse. Satan was not through with Job yet. God tells Satan how Job has stayed faithful despite everything. Satan says, well, of course he did. He's trying to save his own skin. Something happens to him personally, then he will turn on you. Once again, God takes the challenge. God tells Satan he can do anything to Job except kill him. And Satan does. Satan gives Job painful sores all over his body, his entire body covered with them. And what does Job do? He accepts it. Listen to what he says this time. Shall we accept good from God and not trouble? How many of us could do what Job did? Maybe you could. I don't mean to judge you. I don't know. I don't know that I could do it. I mean, I'd like to think so. I'm sure we would all like to think so. But I have no great confidence about it. To lose everything. All your money. All your children. Your health. To have every aspect of your life be nothing but pain and misery and sadness and grief. And to accept it. And to still worship God anyway. Now, those of you who know the story of Job know that later on, Job does start to feel like he's gotten kind of a raw deal here, and we'll come to that later in the sermon series. But Job was able to accept this a lot longer than most of us possibly could. So how was he able to do that? Well, when we look at his statements, I think we see two things. Maybe we could see more. We see at least two. One is a complete acceptance of the fact that God is God. And that you and I have no right to judge anything that God does. He says, the Lord gave, the Lord has taken away. May the name of the Lord be praised. When I read that statement, what I read is a complete and total recognition of who God is. And a complete and total acceptance of who God is. God is stronger than we are. God is more powerful than we are. God is smarter than we are. God is in control of everything. And because of that, God does what God does. God does not have to answer to you and me for what God does. We have no right to judge what God does. We have no say in what God does. There's no reason for us to think we should have any say in what God does. Those are decisions for God to make, not us. Here's the way it seems to me that Job looked at it. Job says, God gave me great wealth, good health, a large family. I did nothing to create all that. That was just a gift from God. God decided for whatever reason to allow me to have all of that. And now God has decided for whatever reason to not allow me to have it. So be it. I have no right to judge that. I have no right to question that. I have no right to complain about that. None of it was ever really mine to begin with. It all belonged to God all the time anyway. All the time, even when I had it, it still really belonged to God. It was God's, it is God's, and God can do with it whatever God chooses to do. But how many of us really look at things that way? How many of us look at everything we have as belonging to God? How many of us look at even our good health, if we have it, as belonging to God? How many of us look at even our children, if we have any, as belonging to God? Now don't get me wrong, I know there are some of us who would say, and who do truly believe, that we know all these things that we have, including our good health, including our children, are a blessing from God. And we may realize that they all came from God. But I don't know if very many of us look at them as all still belonging to God. I think most of us think, that's mine. That's my money. That's my stuff. It's my good health. These are my kids. And we also think, and I'll go ahead and make the decisions about all that. Thank you very much. We may pray. We may ask for God's guidance. But we still think that we have the right to make those decisions because those things belong to me. They don't belong to God. And that's why so many of us, including me, would have a hard time reacting the way Job did. Because we think of all this stuff as being ours. And if they were taken away from us, if our stuff was taken away from us, if our children were taken away from us, we'd be pretty upset about it. Job was not. Job knew they belonged to God and not to him. If God wants to allow them to be taken away, it's all right. It's God's decision to make. The second way Job was able to handle this is shown in Job's second statement. Here it is again. Shall we accept good from God and not trouble? What this shows is Job does not believe that he does not think he deserves to have God give him anything. He does not believe that he has any right to expect God to give him anything. When God decided to bless Job, that was wonderful. Job was very grateful for it. But Job knew he had not earned those blessings. Yes, he was, as described in the Bible. He was a good and righteous man. But Job knew that God was far better, far more righteous than Job could ever dream of being. God did not owe it to Job to bless Job. God did not owe it to Job to do anything. Again, God does what God does. God does not have to answer to you and me for what God does. And so Job knew that if we accept blessings from God without complaint, without a second thought, then we also need to be able to accept it when those blessings are taken away. And accept that without complaint too. But how many of us ever look at things that way? You know, we're always quick to ask, why would God do this when things go wrong? How many of us ever stop and say, why would God do this when things go well? Maybe we do sometimes. I hope we do. But there are a lot of times when we don't. We tend to just accept it when things go right. As if things going right was just God doing what God's supposed to do. As if it was God's job to make sure everything goes smoothly, everything goes well. When things go wrong, that's when we say, well, God's not doing it right. We act like God has fallen down on the job somehow. And we get upset with God for it. See, what happens is that we try to judge God by human standards. We don't think about it that way probably, but that's what we do an awful lot of the time. We want God to live up to our human standards of fairness. We want God to live up to our human standards of justice. We want God to live up to our human standards of right and wrong. And anytime God does not do that, anytime we decide something has happened that is unfair or unjust or just simply not right, we decide that God has failed. God has messed up somehow. Again, we'd never put it that way, but a lot of times that's basically how we feel. But Job did not feel that way. Job was able to handle all these things that Satan did to him because he knew who God was and who God is. God is all-powerful. God is all-wise. God is in control of everything. And God is the owner of everything. So God has every right to do anything God chooses to do. It is not for you and me to tell God what to do. We can ask. But it's not for us to tell God what to do. And it's not for us to judge what God does. It's not for us to demand that God live up to our human standards of fairness or justice or right and wrong. It's for us to accept what God does. Because God is God and we are not. And that can be really hard. But Job did it, at least for a while. And you and I can do it too. Because we are all going to have times when things go wrong, at least by our judgment. But if we remember that everything we are and everything we have belongs to God, we'll be able to handle those things a lot better. And if we remember that it is not for us to judge God, we'll be able to accept whatever happens, both the good and the bad. God is God. You are not. And I certainly am not either. And if we remember that, if we truly take it to heart, we'll be a lot better able to accept the good and the bad. Because we'll know that God is in control. And that anything God allows to happen will be used by God for good. Amen.